Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing well. So welcome to the second video of um, of this new online format of our class. So this is focused on Wallace Stevens. Before I get going, just want to say I miss you guys. It's strange that I won't get to see you. Please keep in touch, send me emails, tell me what you're reading, watching, listening to. I would love to hear from you. Please send me emails. I would love that. Okay, so this video will be hopefully quite a bit shorter than the video I made for William Carlos Williams. The plan here is to first of all give some background on Wallace Stevens, so on his biography, and then kind of talk a little bit about his theories of poetry and his major concerns as an artist, kind of similar to what, similar to what I did with William Carlos Williams. Now, they are not so similar at all. They're quite different. Their concerns, their ideas, their what they are trying to do with poetry is quite different. And then I'm going to go into some kind of ways of reading the three poems that I had you read for today. So this is for Thursday, March 26th. So just three poems. Again, it's kind of easing into this new format here. So Wallace Stevens is kind of the other pole of American modernist poetry to William Carlos Williams. That's part of why I wanted you to read both of them. And we are actually going to read them on the same day in our normal schedule, but I kind of like that we have a day for each of them. So Wallace Stevens, quite on the opposite end of poetry like William Carlos Williams. William Carlos Williams, very simple, very direct, very focused on this kind of connection to the land. Wallace Stevens, not so simple, not so direct, different concerns about what poetry should do. So let me talk a little bit about him. Let's go. All right. Oh no, I'm covering up his picture. Quite a stately gentleman here is Wallace Stevens. He was really tall and I think also very well dressed. He wore, I think, a three-piece suit most every day. So I'm not going to talk about his childhood. We don't need to learn much about that. What I do want to talk about is just kind of how his adult life is really marked by contrasts. So one thing that Stevens actually did have in common with Williams is that Stevens worked, let me move that really quick. So Stevens worked his whole adult life. So he actually was trained as a lawyer, and he worked for different insurance companies, and eventually I think the Hartford Insurance Company, he worked there for most of his adult life in Connecticut. So if you didn't know Stevens as a poet, you probably just thought of him as this kind of like typical suburban, kind of upper middle class gentleman. So he would walk to work every day. His secretary actually would type poems for him. I love this kind of like if he had some kind of inspiration strike while he was at work, his secretary would actually type some stuff out for him as if she was like he was dictating a letter or something. So he was married and had one daughter. He didn't have a very happy marriage, unfortunately. I'm not going to go into that much, but I think there's his life was like relatively boring. I think he didn't have this kind of wild artistic lifestyle. But at the same time, so he was working for an insurance company in Connecticut, but he was also really embedded in the modernist artistic community in New York City. So it was close enough that he could ride the train down to New York City from his home. Especially when he was younger. He did live in New York City for a while. He worked as a journalist when he was like right out of college. That didn't last. He eventually like almost immediately went to law school. But in New York City, he's embedded in the artistic community, just like William Carlos Williams was separated from the New York City modernist world, but could travel there very easily. And so Stevens was connected to the people and to the kind of artistic fervor that was happening in New York City. So it's almost like he lived a double life. He had a real fondness for modern painting, and something that I think is interesting, he's a connoisseur and collector of Asian art. Um, he's interested in kind of decorative art and the decorative quality of visual art. So you kind of see that, I think, in his poetry. Um, so while he was working and living in this kind of middle class or upper middle class lifestyle as a lawyer for an insurance company, he was writing these strange, unexpected poems that I think were really exciting and now really are considered some of the best poetry that was created during the modernist period in America, especially. So William Carlos Williams, one pole of American poetry, Wallace Stevens, another pole of American poetry. This kind of much more of like a uh, almost like romantic, focused on beauty type of poet. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about his writing and his style. So here we can see the cover of his first book of poetry, Harmonium, which was published in 1923. I kind of love this because Stevens was actually 44 at the time of the publication. So he was relatively older. He had been publishing, I think, in modernist magazines, since probably the teens, 1915, 1914. But he was quite old for a first major publication. This book, along with like The Wasteland and with some other major poets, Wastelands by T.S. Eliot, this was a major kind of landmark of modernist poetry, Harmonium. This is a great title too because it suggests something about his poetry. He's really interested in the, like I was talking about, the decorative, the musical quality of poetry. So we can see that in the cover here. We can see that we can hear that in the word harmonium. There's like an intention to musicality. We can see in the design for this cover this interest in decorative and kind of decorative art. So Stevens' early work is really marked by memorable phrasing, surprising and dynamic sense of imagery, and an extraordinary vocabulary. I think you can see even in the three poems we read, the vocabulary is really unexpected at times and quite wide. He's using lots of words. He has a very, very wide vocabulary. He is interested much more than I'd say somebody like Williams in the play and enjoyment of language. So he's there's attention to the beauty and decorative quality of the words, of language, of how they sound together. I love this. He described his poetry once as not a decorative decorative fan, but the decoration on a fan. So he saw his poetry in some ways as this kind of, especially his early poetry, I would say, as this like beautiful objects that we're playing with and reveling within the beauty of language. So his poetry does get philosophical, even in this early poetry, but it's also about the experience of physical earthly beauty, of earthly experience, and then through language. So always thinking about how is the experience of reality mediated or transformed through language in the poetry. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So all three of our poems are from Harmonium. So they're all from his early work. And they kind of, I think, all fit in some ways in this idea of like just kind of enjoying language, and in this idea of the physical experience and the earthly experience, and how that shapes our or how that shapes poetry, or that should be the center of poetry. His later work is much more complex, and they're a lot more philosophical, and they're kind of exploring something similar, the relationship between reality and imagination, but they're I would say much more difficult. Even though these poems that we're reading are kind of difficult, his later work is much longer, much more abstract, much more difficult, complex philosophical explorations. Okay, so that's a little bit about his writing, a little bit about his style. So his aesthetics. Well, what do I mean by aesthetics? This is kind of, this is a word, yeah, I'll put that up there. The aesthetics is kind of his artistic vision. How does he understand art? How does he understand poetry? So he's a poet, so his art is using language to create these poetic objects, these language objects, or language art objects, we could say. So what is his concerns with art? Okay, he understood poetry as the supreme fusion of the creative imagination and objective reality. So these terms, imagination and reality, are really important for understanding or for grasping what Stevens is trying to do in his work. Okay, so poetry is at the center of these things, that the poet takes from reality and through the imagination, transforms reality into something new. He used this word supreme fiction, so a kind of poetry becoming this almost like new world that took from reality but was transformed through imagination. So, but it has to have both. Poetry has to have both. So he says poetry requires the interdependence of the imagination and reality, but as equals. Okay, so he thinks poetry needs, or that imagination and reality need to be interdependent in a poem, and interdependent as equals. Okay, so it's having both is very important, and being aware of both. So he explores this in interesting ways. He often does have poems that kind of almost seem like there's too much imagination or there's too much reality, and sometimes he does that with like attention to seasons. So summer in a place, like he has poems that are set in Key West, become this like place of imagination, but always through this idea of reality or connecting to reality. So you cannot have a poetry that is separate from what you see or what you experience as reality. Okay, so there's two things I want us to think about, and they kind of go along with both of our, or one goes along with each of the Snowman and the Emperor of Ice Cream. So we can see him as a poet of epistemology. So epistemology is the study of how we know, so the study of knowledge. So in his poetry, he explores how we know and how we perceive reality. So there's always this relationship between perceiver and what we perceive in the world. So what is out there as reality, and then who is perceiving that, and how do they see that? And then often this interest or this exploration of, as artists, how do we perceive the world? What is our perception? And then how does that become transformed into something new? The poem, right? The art, the supreme fiction. Okay, so poet of epistemology. So how do we know? How do we know what we know? How do we perceive reality and turn that into something that we know, understand? Okay, so the relationship between how we know and then how we create. And then he's also a poet of phenomenology. So the study of experience of this external world, not the science of objective reality. So he's not, when we use this term reality, he's not so much interested in kind of this realism I want to present reality. I want to, in my poems, present reality as if a mirror, right? Like they did in realism. What he's interested in is the subjective experience of objective reality. So how are you seeing what you see? What is your kind of standpoint as speaker or poet or artist, and how does that um, shape the experience of the external world? So how do we come into contact with the world and make meaning out of it? How do we transform reality through imagination? So how do we come in contact with the world and make meaning out of it? How do we transform reality through imagination? So these are his major concerns here. I know it sounds a little like heady, but what I want you to think about always is in his poems, and I think this is helpful for me in terms of how I read his poems, is thinking about how he is concerned. Here's a poet, and he's kind of standing in between imagination and reality. How does he use imagination to transform reality, to be something new, but to always connect back to it? So what is that relationship between imagination and reality in the poem? So that's what you should be thinking about as you're reading these poems. Again, I want you to listen to this. So keep going. I'm going to move to the poems and talk a little bit about this. Just kind of ways of reading, a little ways, some kind of a guide to these poems. Okay, so the snowman. So in some ways, the snowman, the language here is a little bit more straightforward. It's a little bit, I think you can read the words and kind of understand what's going on. But it's also a little bit confusing. There's a lot of repetition happening, and there's a lot of kind of just subtle changes in the phrasing that I think can make it confusing in terms of what is he trying to get across. One thing I should say about Wallace Stevens is that he wasn't always, I talked about how he was really concerned about the play and enjoyment of language. Excuse me. So you even get to hear me sneeze still. Okay. I don't know why I said that. It's goofy. All right. So he's always concerned. He's interested in the play and enjoyment and the beauty of language. So his poems don't always quote unquote mean something. I think we can interpret them. We can look at them and kind of seek or find like a purpose there, or kind of a nugget that we can take. But also, some, like with these poems, just try to enjoy the language and kind of the sound of the language. Okay, so the snowman. I read this as a poem about the relationship between the imagination and reality. So it's really, so some questions to think about as you're moving through this poem. Again, read it first and then maybe think about these questions. So how can a poet or artist record the experience of reality? How can they record what they see, what they witness, what they witness outside of themselves? What is required to fully transform reality? In this case, it's a winter landscape into a poem, right? So the reality here is this winter landscape. What does it take for a poet to not just record, right? Because we're trying to do more than just show external reality, but transform it into something new, into art, into the supreme fiction. So this is really about the experience of looking, not so much just looking. Okay, so I think I talked a little bit about William Carlos Williams as an imagist poet, of somebody who's interested in kind of recording visual experience, or offering visual experience, really focusing on the image. So Stevens is not imagist. He's focused on the person who is seeing the image. I hope that makes sense, right? I'll talk a little bit more about that. So these are the main questions. So how can a poet or artist record or transform the experience of reality? How can they take their experience What is required of them to take that experience of witnessing something and turn it into a poem, right? So it seems here that he's saying that your mind, right, your imagination needs to match, or your body even needs to somehow match the thing that you are looking at, or the scene that you are looking at, to then record it and to transform it into something new. Okay, so one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun. Right? Okay, so what must somebody do? What must a witnesser do to then fully kind of take in the scene that they're seeing? That's what it's pushing towards, or forcing us to ask. So it's really a poem about the process of creation. It is a poem about this landscape, right? It is a poem about seeing this winter landscape, but it's also a poem about transforming that landscape into poetry, into art. So it's a poem about the process of creation, or what is required to create out of reality. I want you to pay attention to language choices here. There's some really interesting choices. So in the first stanza, there's regard, and then the second stanza, it changes to behold. What is the difference of these verbs? Why the difference? What does this suggest? In my mind, he said that Stevens, or to my mind, that there is something different about regard and behold. Behold's a little bit more, there's less going on in the mind. It's just kind of I see this, I behold it. Regard, there is a little bit more kind of processing happening. So why regard? Well, maybe because he's saying something about the mind of winter. So there needs to be something internal. The other time, the next stanza, he says you have to been cold a long time to behold. So it's maybe more about the physical experience. I don't know. This is just kind of thoughts. So pay attention to these kind of language choices. I also want you to pay attention to the sensory experience, or the visual experience the poet records. So we get these visual descriptions, the pine trees crusted with snow. We get the junipers shagged with ice. That's a really great image here. So we both see what's happening, but it's not about just presenting what we see. It's about how you think about what you see. So it's both sensory experience here, and then the individual subjective experience of the scene. So it's not just, so this is what I'm trying to get at with the difference between him and like a William Carlos Williams. It's not just the scene, it's the person who's looking at the scene. It's the person's experience about the thing that we see. Okay, that might not make sense, but think about that a little bit. So how is that happening here? Think about repetition of certain words. The word sound is repeated. Wind, nothing. Also just thinking about sensory experience. When is it visual? When is it aural in terms of like hearing? There's sound of the wind, the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place, right? So how does sound, and how does like the sound of the words shift, or how do we shift towards sound, and then the words kind of embody or manifest that shift towards sound. And then these ending lines are really interesting. And nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So there's this, I think, maybe an interesting echo of Emerson here. So saying nothing himself makes me think of, I am a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all, right? This kind of emptying of self in terms of artistic, aesthetic or spiritual experience. So do you see that? Do you agree with that? I mean, that's something to think about. Um, and then there's some other questions I want you to kind of dig into. What does it mean to behold nothing that is not there? What does this suggest about the speaker's vision? There seems to be like to say that they behold nothing that is not there. So it's almost like the vision is so focused on what we see that we're not moving to other things that we perceive or see. So keep thinking about that. And then this is interesting, the nothing that is. How can nothing be? How can nothing be present, right? So the nothing that is, you'll see Stevens really likes ending sentences with these be verbs. Is, be, that's something that's interesting. And the nothing that is, how can nothing be present? Well, it's present in the poem as this word. That's interesting to think about. But it's almost like there's this absence and presence here. I don't totally know what to make of it, but I want you to think about that. Okay, that's the snowman. Cool, interesting poem. Hopefully you'll agree. Now I want us to think about the Emperor of Ice Cream. So we're at the Emperor of Ice Cream, just showing you the full title. Okay, it's important, I think, to look at this slide before reading the poem. This little description, I think, can kind of unlock the mystery of what's actually happening in the poem, which will then allow you to dig deeper in some of the interesting choices that Stevens makes. So this comes from Helen Bendler. She's a major critic of Stevens. And she writes, the basic story of the Emperor is that of a person who goes to the house of a neighbor, a poor old woman who has died. The person is to help lay out or arrange for decent viewing the corpse in the bedroom, while other neighbors are sending over homegrown flowers, and yet others are preparing food, including ice cream, for the wake. So the wake is this kind of this period of time where a body will be laid out and people will come and pay respects to that person who's died. So Stevens plots this story into two equal stanzas. So one is the kitchen where the ice cream is being made, and then the other is the bedroom where the corpse awaits decent covering. So he plots it further by structuring the poem as a series of commands from an unknown master of ceremonies, directing, in a diction of extreme oddness, the neighbors in their funeral duties. So we're in a context, we're in a funeral context, we're in a context of death, and we're probably in a context of neighborhood and maybe lower income, poor neighborhood, because this woman seems like all the neighborhood has to pitch in to celebrate this woman, to pay their respects to this woman. Okay, so it's a poem about death. But what I want you to think about first and foremost, does it sound like a poem about death? It's called The Emperor of Ice Cream. It doesn't seem like a poem that would be exploring the death of an old woman. But that's the context here. That's the story. Okay, so some things I want you to think about. The elevated and exuberant diction. It's almost like a whimsical poem. There's some rhyme here. There's a musical quality to the language, and as this kind of description of the poem describes, it's written as a series of commands. So there is this focus again on the speaker's perspective. So it's not just like that. There is a mediator here. The speaker is mediating what we see as readers. And it's mediated in this really strange tense, and it's said as commands. So it's like, it's not just like I'm describing this or the speaker is describing it. It's like we see the speaker seeing what's happening, but he's like making it happen almost like a play. Is that okay? Maybe that makes sense. So what's going on there? So we are in a context of death. We're in a space that's probably lower income neighborhood. So why the elevated exuberant diction? Then we're also in contrast, and we're in contrast of space, and the two stanzas also have this contrast of kind of energy, maybe. So the first one is really focused on sensuous bodily experience. So think about the way these people are described. The muscular roller of cigars. They call the ice cream, I can't say this word, but we all know what word I'm talking about, concupiscent. So it's this really kind of sensual understanding of the ice cream. So look that word up, try to understand what's happening. So that's like these women who walk around are wenches. It's almost like this medieval fair or something. And then the boys are bringing flowers. So there's this kind of energy that's happening in the first stanza. Then the second stanza, we move from the energy of the kitchen, of the energy of the preparation, to the preparation of the dead body. So we move from kind of life and bodies alive to a body not alive. So we see her feet, and we know they're covering her with a sheet that she's embroidered. So that's really interesting. What's happening with the sheet? Why does it matter that it's embroidered? What does that suggest about the woman who's died, or who they are laying out here? But really, it's about death, right? So if her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. That's interesting too. Like the body is cold, like the ice cream is cold, even though there's lots of life in this kind of scene of creating the ice cream or making the ice cream. It reflects the death of the coldness that the woman is in death. And let the lamp affix its beam, it's this kind of like, we have to see the death, right? We have to see this woman. It can't all just be this medieval fair in the kitchen. So a couple of lines just to be thinking about. Let be finale of seem. Okay, it's like one of those sentences like, well, I know all these words, but how does this work together? So here's like just kind of another way to think about it. It's basically saying let artifice and illusion give way to plain reality. Let everything kind of, all this illusion break down. So let be, so whatever is actually happening, let that end this idea of illusion, seem, what could happen. My question about this though is, does the poem let be finale of seem? Or is there a kind of artifice? Is there a kind of something happening that transforms the scene, that transforms reality to this new imaginative experience? I think there might be. I don't know. You should think about that. And then, of course, we have to talk about this idea of the emperor of ice cream. What is it suggesting here, right? So if the only emperor around is the emperor of ice cream, what does that say? What does that suggest? We know we're in like a poorer neighborhood. We know we're in this moment of death. So what does it mean that the only emperor, the only kind of important figure here is the person who's stirring the ice cream, right? If you've ever made homemade ice cream, we have machines now that are electric. They do this, but this would be somebody who is actually turning like a wheel to create the ice cream. What does it mean that he is emperor? Does it mean that anything we're doing to celebrate this woman matters because this is the only emperor, this is the only kind of important figure here? I don't know. Think about that. Okay? All right, so that's the Emperor of Ice Cream. So lastly, I want you to read this poem, Tea. It's an 8-line poem. Let's just read it real quick. When the elephant's ear in the park shriveled in frost and the leaves on the paths ran like rats, your lamplight fell on shining pillows of sea shades and sky shades like umbrellas in Java. Just a quick little poem here. It is not in your book, so I actually have it as a page under the module, the Wallace Stevens module. So make sure just to read that. Why I wanted you to read it, I think it's a great stuck indoors poem. So it's like somebody looking out the window, it's winter, and the park is going from summer to winter. So the leaves have fallen. They're on the path like rats. The elephant ears, which is a big kind of big tropical leaf, is shriveling up. So we're all stuck indoors. I think it's kind of a nice little stuck indoors poem. Again, here we're thinking about the perspective of speaker. So there's a mediation happening. So there is this visual scene. There's this visual scene. There's the speaker, and then there's us. Okay. So it offers the experience of seeing something. There's a kind of visual scene happening. It's the experience of seeing something. I think we see that there's a you're here, so we have a clear sense that there is a speaker, there is somebody else there. We're in this space at a specific time of winter. I love this poem too because there's this movement from cold to warm. We kind of imaginatively move to Java, which is an island in Indonesia. So we kind of move from winter to a tropical landscape. I want to think about this poem as like a companion or a contrast to The Red Wheelbarrow. Both 8-line poems. I think that's really interesting. Both poems really focused on visual experience. But think about it. What's different? I think both poems kind of embody the poet, their writer, or they show something really distinctive about each poet. So I want you to think about that. What in The Red Wheelbarrow, like what do we see that's distinctive about Williams, and what do we see in T that's distinctive about Stevens, and how does that kind of bump up against each other? They're doing something quite different, I think, and these small little poems show that. Okay, that's it. All right, so remember, you need to respond specifically to one of the questions I'm assigning the groups. Are going to be different than the William Carlos Williams groups. So that you'll see on Canvas. It'll be, I think you'll figure that out easy. If you have questions about these poems, please ask. There's also some great resources online. The Poetry Foundation has some good stuff. So don't be shy. Stevens is not the easiest poet in the world. Again, I just want you to try to get an experience of him. I think first and foremost, trying to remember this relationship between imagination and reality and how that works in his poetry. That's always a good starting point, an entry point to the poems. But also, like, it's okay to just kind of get lost in the language, the musical quality of the language. These are interesting, if not kind of beautiful poems. So just think about the language here. All right, y'all. I will be back with a new video soon. Doing a great job. Talk to you soon.